Kötülük Allah'ın varlığı için delil midir?
Is evil a proof for the existence of God?
It's common to think that evil provides evidence or even very strong evidence against the existence of God. And those arguments are very important and need to be engaged carefully. But there are some arguments that point in the other direction. So there are certain things about evil that seem to point to the existence of God. Now, I'm not going to claim that these things outweigh the other arguments, but they definitely provide some reason to think that God is real. And then there are some arguments coming from evil that point more specifically in the direction of Christian theism and not just plain theism. And so there are really three arguments I'd love to talk about. So, and I'll give each one briefly, and then we can talk more. The first is that if we think about what evil is, we need a characterization of evil. And one good characterization, which I got from my friend Doug Guyvett, is that evil is when things are not the way they ought to be. And that's why we react against evil, or we want to change it and fix it and solve the problem. But if this characterization is accurate, then this implies that there is a way things ought to be. And of course, that's a very strange fact if there's no God, because there's a kind of intention or goal or design behind reality. There's a way it ought to be and a way it shouldn't be. And we find these kinds of features when we are looking at things that are made by people for particular reasons. So if you think about your automobile, there's a way it ought to run, and then there are ways it shouldn't run. And that's because it's something that's designed. Well, if there's an intention or goal or design behind the world, it makes more sense that the world is something that's designed. And of course, that points to God. So the first argument is from the very nature of evil, that evil is a departure from the way things ought to be. And that shows that there is a way things ought to be. And that fact, of course, makes more sense if God exists and created the world for his reasons. I think when people bring up evil as evidence against the existence of God, their arguments assume a couple of things. It assumes that evil is bad, because otherwise, why would they expect God to prevent evil if evil's not bad? But they very rarely spend time thinking about where this sense of badness comes from, and what is it about evil that is bad. It has to be more than just we don't like things that are evil. And of course, there are things in the world we like and things we don't like, and people have lots of different preferences. But the argument against God from evil requires a stronger picture that evil isn't something that should be there. And it's this observation that the argument is spending time on, and saying, well, look, if evil really is a distortion of the way things should be, and if the way things should be is good, then we have to ask, why is this the case? Why do we expect that things ought to be good? And it's very hard to come up with a satisfying answer that doesn't imply that there is some kind of teleology in the world. And of course, teleology, it comes from the Greek about ends, like goals, purposes. The world is directed towards some end, and the end is that it's good, right? So the thing that Guyvit, who first suggested this, what he did that was unique was he started to ask atheist philosophers to explain what they meant by evil. And he said it's very hard to get a good explanation that doesn't imply intention or goal or design. But of course, intention or goal or design makes the most sense if God is real. I mean, if naturalism is true, and most fundamentally only matter and energy exists, and stuff that's built out of matter and energy, it's very hard to find room for kind of moral goals and moral intentions and ends. And so this is really the observation that makes up this argument. So on the one hand, we might think that, if God is real, we shouldn't expect so much evil in the world. But our very understanding of evil implies that there's a way things should be, which makes the most sense if God is there. So that's how I would flesh out this argument. It's actually not a very complicated philosophically argument. It's really just, let's think about what we mean when we call something evil, and take seriously this concept. And secondly, we don't have to argue that evil is impossible without God. We just are arguing that the existence and nature of God provides the better explanation for this goal, this purpose, this intentionality. Another point, I mean, in the article you referred to, I spent a little time talking about the distinct contribution of Christian theism to the problem of evil. And that comes up in a couple of ways. One is this: people raise the problem of evil as if the existence of horrible evil is a problem for the existence of God. And of course, that makes sense to us when we first encounter it. But it's clear that the existence of horrible evil is not a problem for Christianity, because Christianity is itself a story about how God rescues us from horrible evil. And the way sometimes I say it is this: if there was not a lot of horrible evil, then we would know that Christianity is false, right? Because Christianity can't be true without horrible evil. And that element is surprising for people who start thinking about the problem of evil just by thinking of kind of what we can call a generic God, a basic concept of God, independent of the details of Christianity. And so in this way, evil, even horrible evil, is not a strong problem against Christianity, because Christianity requires it. I think this is a point that has not been observed very much, and there's lots of reasons for it. Most of these arguments for and against God are structured with just a minimal concept of God. Like, God is a being that's unlimited in knowledge, power, and goodness, and God created the universe. There's not much more content to that. And there's a whole history in philosophy of making these arguments this way. But what's interesting is not many people believe that concept of God and nothing else. Most people are Christians or Muslims or Jewish believers, and they have a concept of God that's like that, but it's embedded in more theological content. And it's certainly true for Christianity, which is what I know best. So not only does evil itself seem to give some evidence for God, but it's not really in tension with Christianity at all. Now, a person might wonder about a specific case of evil, and that might raise what philosophers sometimes call an existential problem of evil, in terms of, how do I make sense of my life in light of this evil? But that's not a philosophical argument against the existence of God. That's more a challenge to my continuing to believe in light of troubles that I face. But if Christianity is true, then these troubles are things that are common in the world, even though they disrupt our living. This is the kind of world we live in since human beings began to rebel against God.